The night that changed my life started with a small hand resting on my shoulder. I opened my eyes and saw my 8-year-old son, Liam, standing beside my bed. The room was dark except for the faint light coming through the window. He wasn't crying, but something about his face immediately made me sit up. "Dad," he whispered, glancing toward the hallway. "I need to show you something tomorrow." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned around and quietly walked back to his room. At the time, I assumed it was something childish. Maybe a school project, a drawing, or a toy he wanted me to see. I had no idea that his words would become the beginning of the hardest chapter of my life. Until then, I believed I had everything a man could ask for. I had been married to my wife, Emily, for 11 years. We met when we were young, built a life together, and eventually welcomed Liam into the world. Like every couple, we had disagreements, but nothing that ever made me question our future. At least, that's what I told myself. From the outside, we looked like a happy family. We attended school events together, celebrated birthdays, and spent weekends watching movies in the living room. Friends often commented on how lucky we were. What they didn't see were the changes that had slowly started appearing over the previous few months. Emily began working later than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her company had recently gone through restructuring, and she claimed the workload had increased. I wanted to be supportive, so I accepted the explanation without questioning it. Then the late nights became normal. She started coming home exhausted, barely speaking during dinner. Sometimes she would smile at her phone while sitting alone on the couch. If I asked what was so funny, she'd quickly lock the screen and say it was nothing important. Small things began piling up. She changed her phone password after years of never having one. She started taking calls in other rooms. Simple conversations felt forced. The warmth that once existed between us was fading, and neither of us seemed willing to talk about it. Whenever I brought up my concerns, she blamed stress from work. I wanted to believe her. The truth is that when you've spent over a decade with someone, your mind naturally searches for innocent explanations. You don't want to imagine betrayal. You don't want to believe the person you trust most could be hiding something. While I struggled to understand Emily's behavior, I noticed another change inside our home. Liam wasn't acting like himself. He had always been energetic and talkative. Suddenly, he became quiet. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at his mother with a strange expression, almost like he was worried about something. More than once, he started a sentence and stopped halfway through. "Dad, can I tell you something?" Then he'd shake his head and walk away. It happened often enough that I began wondering what was bothering him. But every time I asked, he'd insist everything was fine. The following night, after another distant dinner and another evening where Emily barely looked up from her phone, I went to bed feeling uneasy. Sometime after midnight, I felt that small hand on my shoulder again. I opened my eyes and saw Liam standing beside my bed. This time, he looked even more nervous. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Dad," he whispered, "I need to show you something tomorrow." The next morning, Liam barely touched his breakfast. He kept glancing at me, then at his mother. Emily seemed distracted as usual, scrolling through her phone while drinking coffee. Whatever Liam wanted to show me, he clearly didn't want to discuss it in front of her. As soon as Emily left for work and Liam knew we were alone, he walked into the living room carrying a tablet. "Dad, can you promise not to get mad at me?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "Why would I get mad at you?" He looked down at the floor. "Because I wasn't trying to look." I sat beside him and told him he could tell me anything. Liam explained that a few weeks earlier, he had borrowed his mother's tablet to play a game. While using it, a notification appeared on the screen. At first, he ignored it, but then more messages came from the same person. He handed me the device. I took pictures because it looked important. My heart immediately started racing. Liam opened a folder containing several photos he had secretly taken with his own phone. They showed message notifications from a contact saved only as J. Most of the messages weren't fully visible, but what I could read made me uncomfortable. One message read, "I can't stop thinking about last night." Another said, "I wish we had more time together." My hands felt cold. I quickly searched for a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a close friend. Maybe there was context I wasn't seeing. I refused to jump to conclusions based on a few incomplete messages. Liam, I said carefully, you did the right thing by telling me. He looked relieved. I didn't know if I should.
Why?
Because Mom gets nervous whenever that person's messages show up. That answer hit harder than I expected. Children notice far more than adults realize. I thanked him and told him not to worry about it anymore. Whatever was happening, it wasn't his responsibility. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. The messages replayed in my mind over and over. For years, I had trusted Emily completely. Now I found myself questioning things I had never questioned before. That evening, I paid closer attention than usual. When her phone buzzed during dinner, she immediately flipped it face down. When I asked how work was going, her answers were short and vague. When I suggested we spend the weekend together as a family, she hesitated before saying she might have work obligations. The excuses that once sounded believable suddenly felt rehearsed. Over the next several days, I stopped ignoring the details. I noticed she smiled at her phone far more than she smiled at me. I noticed she became defensive whenever I asked simple questions. I noticed gaps in her stories. Little inconsistencies. Small contradictions. Nothing large enough to prove anything, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately. Another part feared the answer. Because once a question like that is asked, there's no going back. One afternoon, Emily told me she had an important meeting after work and would be home late again. I simply nodded. For the first time, I didn't believe her. Hours later, I found myself sitting in my car several blocks away from the office building where she claimed to be working. I felt ridiculous. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the jealous husband who followed his wife. I was a man searching for peace of mind. I told myself that after tonight, everything would be clear. Either my fears would disappear, or they would be confirmed. Around 6 o'clock, I watched Emily leave the building. She wasn't carrying work documents. She wasn't heading toward a meeting. Instead, she walked confidently down the street. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me. A few minutes later, she stopped outside a small restaurant. Then I saw him. A man standing near the entrance. The moment Emily saw him, her entire face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. He smiled. She smiled back. And as they walked inside together, I realized one painful truth. Whoever he was, he definitely wasn't a coworker. I sat in my car long after they disappeared inside the restaurant. Part of me wanted to storm in and demand answers. Another part knew emotions wouldn't help me. If I confronted Emily without proof, she could deny everything and make me look paranoid. So I waited. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I barely recognized. I paid attention. I observed. I stopped accepting explanations at face value. Every time Emily claimed she was working late, I quietly checked whether her story matched reality. Most of the time, it didn't. The restaurant wasn't a one-time meeting. It happened again. And again. Sometimes they met for dinner. Sometimes they walked together through a nearby shopping district. Once, I watched them sit on a park bench talking for nearly 2 hours. The worst part wasn't seeing them together. The worst part was seeing how happy she looked. That smile used to belong to me. Eventually, I gathered enough evidence that there was no room left for doubt. I found hotel receipts hidden inside an email account she thought I didn't know existed. I discovered dozens of messages exchanged over several months. The conversations weren't professional. They weren't innocent. They weren't misunderstandings. They were the messages of 2 people involved in a relationship. Reading them felt like being punched repeatedly. Every future plan we had discussed. Every promise we had made. Every memory I believed was special. All of it suddenly felt contaminated by deception. I couldn't understand how someone could look me in the eye every day while living a completely different life behind my back. What hurt even more was realizing how long Liam had been carrying this burden alone. He had noticed things because children notice changes. Children notice secrets. Children notice tension. While Emily and I were living under the same roof pretending everything was normal, our son had been watching the truth unfold. I barely slept during those weeks. Anger would keep me awake. Then sadness would replace the anger. Then confusion would replace the sadness. I wasn't just losing trust in my wife. I was losing trust in my own judgment. How had I missed this? How had I ignored so many signs? Finally, I reached a point where I couldn't continue pretending. One evening after Liam had gone to his room, I placed printed copies of the messages on the dining table. Emily walked in and immediately froze. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. She already knew. The evidence sitting in front of her made denial impossible. "What is this?" she asked quietly. I looked directly at her. "You tell me." She stared at the papers. Then she sat down. For the first few minutes, she tried to minimize everything. She claimed she had been confused. She claimed it wasn't what it looked like. She claimed she never intended for things to go this far. But every explanation collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Eventually, the truth came out. The relationship had started months earlier. What began as emotional support had turned into something much more serious. She admitted meeting him regularly. She admitted lying repeatedly. And she admitted she didn't know how to end it. I listened without interrupting. By that point, the shock was gone. Only exhaustion remained. The woman sitting across from me no longer felt like the person I had married. When the conversation finally ended, neither of us had tears left. We both understood that our marriage had suffered damage that couldn't simply be repaired with apologies. The following days were painfully quiet. We discussed practical matters. We discussed Liam. We discussed what would happen next. For the first time in months, there were no more lies. The truth was finally in the open. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought uncovering the affair would bring clarity. I was wrong. A few nights later, Liam knocked on my bedroom door. His expression was serious. "Dad," he said softly, "there's something else I never told you." The moment I heard those words, I realized the story wasn't finished yet. I looked at Liam and told him to sit down. The seriousness in his face immediately worried me. After everything that had already happened, I couldn't imagine what else there was to say. For a few moments, he stayed quiet. Then he finally spoke. "Dad, I knew about him before I showed you the messages." I felt my chest tighten. "How long?" Liam stared at the floor. "A few months." The answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the affair itself. I already knew about that. What hurt was realizing my son had been carrying that secret alone for months. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. His eyes immediately filled with tears. "Because I was scared." Those 4 words broke my heart. He explained that he had started noticing strange things long before I did. He had seen his mother texting constantly. He had overheard conversations. He had noticed how differently she acted whenever certain notifications appeared on her phone. At first, he didn't understand what any of it meant. But children are more observant than most adults realize. Eventually, he started putting the pieces together. "What were you scared of?" I asked. His voice shook. "I thought if I told you, our family would end." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Everything suddenly became clear. While I had been focused on my marriage, Liam had been focused on protecting his family. He wasn't worried about secrets. He wasn't worried about lies. He was worried about losing his parents. The burden he carried was never supposed to be his responsibility. Yet he carried it anyway because he loved us. Then he said something I will never forget. I kept hoping Mom would stop. I closed my eyes. That single sentence revealed how much emotional weight he had been carrying. He hadn't wanted revenge. He hadn't wanted conflict. He had simply wanted his family to stay together. Every day he waited, hoping the problem would disappear on its own. Every day, he watched the tension grow. Every day, he felt more trapped. I moved beside him and wrapped my arms around him. For the first time since the entire situation began, I cried. Not because of my marriage. Not because of the betrayal. Because of my son. No child should ever feel responsible for protecting adults from the consequences of their own choices. I told him none of this was his fault. I told him he had done nothing wrong. Most importantly, I told him he would never have to carry that burden again. Over the following months, life changed dramatically. Emily and I separated. The process wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, painful decisions, moments when emotions ran high. But despite everything, we both agreed on one thing. Liam's well-being had to come first. For the first time in a long time, honesty replaced secrets. The marriage was over, but the constant tension was gone. The uncertainty was gone. The lies were gone. Healing wasn't immediate. Trust doesn't magically return after betrayal. Some wounds take time. Others leave permanent scars. But slowly, life became manageable again. Liam started smiling more. The worry that had once been visible in his eyes gradually disappeared. We spent more time together. We talked openly. We rebuilt something that had almost been damaged by the silence surrounding us. One evening nearly a year later, Liam and I were sitting together when he casually laughed about something that happened at school. As I watched him smile, I realized how different he looked. He finally seemed free. And so did I. Looking back now, I often think about that night when I woke up and found him standing beside my bed. At the time, I thought he was coming to me with a simple childhood concern. I had no idea he was carrying a truth that would change everything. The truth hurt. It destroyed the future I thought I was building. It forced me to face realities I never wanted to face. But it also saved me from living inside a lie. Most people expect life-changing moments to arrive with dramatic warnings. Mine arrived as a quiet whisper in the middle of the night from a frightened little boy who simply loved his father. In the end, the person who opened my eyes wasn't a private investigator. It wasn't a friend. It wasn't a stranger. It was my son. And although losing my marriage was painful, gaining the truth was ultimately the beginning of a better life. Because sometimes the people who protect us the most are the ones we least expect. Sometimes they're standing right beside our bed, waiting for the courage to speak. And sometimes the smallest voice tells the biggest truth.